At the doorway of a pediatric room at St. Arden Children's Hospital, hotel magnate Grant Halston stood frozen with his briefcase hanging from his hand. Not because he lacked money or influence, but because inside that room, Hayne didn't obey anyone. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and old coffee, and the steady beep, beep of monitors sliced through the air like a verdict. When the camera opens on the room, you see Harper, his 7-year-old daughter, lying there with her head shaved and 4 dripping above the bed, and a fragile smile that doesn't match all those machines. But what really holds the eye is the woman sitting beside her, Nora, the house employee, in a simple uniform and yellow cleaning gloves, holding the girl's hand like family, firm, present, without making a scene. Grant takes one step and stops again. He doesn't understand why that woman is there, so close, in a place he thought was only his. His gaze moved from the gloves to Harper's face, and back again, like he's afraid to ask the right question and find out the answer will hurt more than the illness. There's one small detail in that scene, tiny, almost hidden, that changes everything and is about to knock the most powerful man in that hallway to his knees. Before I tell you what it is, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Your city, your state, your country? Grant Halston, owner of a massive hotel chain and used to making the world obey, walked down the hallway of St. Arden Children's Hospital with the same posture as always. But on the inside, he was falling apart. The expensive suit looked completely out of place in that smell of alcohol, gloves, and burnt coffee. With every step, the sound of monitors and the rush of nurses felt like a countdown. In his coat pocket, his phone buzzed nonstop. Directors, lawyers, meetings, as if his life still had some kind of order. But here, standing in front of this door, nothing answered to money. He stopped with his hand on the frame, staring at the room number like it was an enemy. Inside was Harper, his 7-year-old daughter, way too small for so many tubes, fighting leukemia with a silence that hurt. Grant had come prepared to hear the worst. Her levels dropped. Her body isn't responding. We're doing everything we can. He'd heard those phrases before, and every time it felt like swallowing glass. But when he slowly pushed the door open, what he saw wasn't fear. It was shock, because the scene wasn't just his daughter lying there, pale, surrounded by machines. There was someone else in the room, sitting beside the bed, arm outstretched with a blood bag hanging from a metal stand. That person's hand trembled a little, but the face was steady, focused, like they were doing something simple, even though it wasn't. Grant recognized the basic uniform, the cheap coat folded over the chair, the way she kept her eyes lowered so she wouldn't bother anyone. It was Nora, the woman who worked in his house, the one he almost never called by name because he was always too busy to notice people. He froze so completely, it felt like even the air stopped. His eyes moved from the needle in her arm to the clear line, and then to Harper, as if his brain was trying to fit the pieces together. His throat went dry. A doctor said something low out in the hall. Someone walked by with a soft, "Excuse me," but Grant barely heard. And in the middle of that strange silence, if this story has already grabbed you, hit subscribe and stay with me, because there are things you only understand when you see up close what pride tries to hide. When he finally managed to take a step, Grant felt his knees threaten to give out. He didn't walk in like the billionaire used to having his way. He walked in as a father, chest tight, not sure if he should ask for an explanation or for forgiveness. The cold hospital light reflected off tears he was still trying to hold back. Nora didn't look at him right away. She kept her arm extended, like any sudden move could break something important. And that is when Grant noticed a detail that made his blood run cold. No one seemed eager to explain how that woman ended up in this room, and her name was nowhere on any chart. When a nurse pulled the clipboard closer, like she was hiding information, it became clear there was a secret behind that donation, and he was about to find out the hard way. That same morning, no one had called Nora. The Halston house was quiet, the kind of quiet that looks elegant on the outside, but feels heavy on the inside. She finished the basics, grabbed her worn-out bag, and stood in the hallway for a moment, like something invisible was tugging her chest in another direction. It wasn't some pretty feeling. It was a deep unease, the kind that doesn't to let you just keep living like nothing is happening. Nora tried to ignore it, washed her hands, took a breath. But even so, her legs were already moving. The ride to St. Arden was long, cold, and full of thoughts she didn't want to have. On the bus, she stared at her own palm, remembering what the nurse had said days earlier in a quick phone call asking for donors. The girl's blood type was rare, hard to find, and the hospital was racing against time. When Nora walked into the lobby, the air smelled like disinfectant and exhaustion. She didn't go to the main reception trying to be seen. She went straight to the donor desk, asking for information in a low, almost embarrassed voice, like she was doing something wrong just by being there. That's where a nurse on duty, Maya Patel, noticed her hurried, quiet way. Maya didn't ask about money, last name, or who are you. She just looked at the form, checked the blood type, and froze for a second, like she just found the missing piece. "You're O negative?" she asked carefully. Nora nodded, a small, quick movement, and the nurse took a deep breath, calling another tech to start the protocol. The hallway leading to the blood center felt even wider, even colder. And while she was signing the papers, Nora made one thing clear, voice suddenly firm for the first time. "I don't want him to know." "Not yet." Maya, used to desperate families, hesitated. "Why?" she asked, no judgment, just trying to understand. Nora swallowed and answered quietly, "Because if they know my name, this turns into something else. I just came to give what I have." She asked to be registered as an anonymous donor, asked them not to gossip, not to go running to the room to tell the father. When Maya nodded and led her into the collection room, Nora let out a breath like she'd finally accepted her own decision. But the moment she stretched out her arm and felt the needle touch her skin, something stirred in her chest. This wasn't just a donation. There was an old memory hiding there, waiting to break loose. The transfusion room was small and cold, with harsh white light that had no mercy on anyone. Nora sat in a reclining chair, arm resting on the support, tourniquet tight above her elbow. The clear tube slowly began to fill, and the sound of the machines, that relentless beep, pounded inside her head. Maya Patel watched everything carefully, without invading. The hospital had seen 1,000 stories like this, and still, this one carried a different weight. O negative didn't walk through the door every day. And Nora, sitting there, looked like she was giving away more than just a number on a chart. At first, she stayed quiet. She stared at the wall, at the clock, at her own knee, trembling just a little. But silence, when you're doing something this big, turns into noise on the inside. Her breathing shifted, her eyes grew wet, and without noticing, her free hand reached for a simple necklace under her uniform. Maya noticed and asked softly, "You doing okay?" Nora answered, "Yeah," but she wasn't. Her body was there, steady, obeying. But memory had already opened a door she'd been avoiding for years. When the transfusion was cleared for the pediatric room, they carried the blood bag carefully, like glass. Nora asked to go along, even though she was weak, even though she insisted she was fine. In the hallway, the smell of alcohol and plastic mixed with expensive perfume, coming from someone who Dee rushed by, turned her stomach. When they got near the bed, she saw Harper, so small, so still, with a pale face and long lashes resting on fragile skin. The girl slept a heavy sleep, chest rising and falling, like even breathing was a fight. Nora touched the edge of the bed gently, like she was asking permission just to exist there. And that's when she started to sing, very softly, almost like a prayer that didn't want to be heard. It was an old lullaby, simple, the kind that fits on your tongue, even when your heart is broken. The melody felt too familiar in that room. Even Maya, in the background, froze for a second. Nora sang looking straight at Harper, and as the blood began to flow through the line, her face tightened, not from physical pain, but from the ache of memory. Because that song wasn't random. It was the same lullaby a woman, a long time ago, used to sing to calm this same little girl, before disappearing from her world in a way nobody in that mansion dared to talk about. And as Nora finished the verse, she whispered something no one was supposed to hear. "I'm here, my love. I promised." Grant Halston stepped into the room with urgency swallowed by shock. The door had barely closed behind him, and he was already standing still, like his body had shut down. His daughter was there, fragile, tangled in wires and light, and as if the world had decided to mock the control he thought he had. There was a woman sitting beside her, connected to Harper by a thin line carrying life. Simple uniform, wrinkled gloves in her lap, tired face. It was Nora, the same woman who walked the halls of his house every day, and yet he'd never really seen her. Grant's first impulse was anger, not at the donation, at the fact that no one had told him, at someone deciding something inside his life without asking for permission. His hand clenched into a fist, his jaw locked, and he took a short step forward, ready to demand what was going on. But the sound of the monitor, the heavy air in the room, and the sight of Harper's cracked lips shattered whatever speech he'd been building. His money had already bought doctors, machines, specialists. And still, the most important thing in that room was coming from the arm of someone whose last name he barely knew. Nora slowly lifted her eyes. There was no fear there. No defiance either. Just a steady, quiet look from someone who knows exactly what she's doing, and eyes ended looking for applause. Grant felt a knot form in his throat when he realized she was pale, sweating, clearly exhausted, and still sitting there, holding herself together. The blood bag hanging from the pole looked like a clock counting down time he couldn't negotiate. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. And in that instant, reality hit him like a punch. He, Grant Halston, who'd always thought he was above humiliation, was being saved by a gesture that didn't come from power. It came from compassion. His breathing stuttered. His eyes filled without his consent. And without realizing, he stepped closer to the bed and gently took his daughter's hand, like it was made of glass. Kneeling wasn't part of his world, but his legs folded on their own, as if his body finally understood that here there was no status, only love and fear. When he bowed his head, a tear fell onto the spotless hospital sheet. And the worst, or maybe the most honest part, was that Grant still had no idea what made that scene even more impossible. There was a reason Nora knew that lullaby. And that reason was about to come to light the moment he demanded an explanation. Grant was still on his knees when he finally found his voice. It wasn't a shout or an explosion. It was a rough, almost broken question, like he was afraid of the answer. He stood up slowly, looking from his daughter to Nora and then to the transfusion line, as if he could somehow undo this with an order. "Why did you do this without talking to me?" he asked, trying to keep his tone firm and faltering halfway through. The word "without" came out as an accusation, and to me, came out of the mouth of a man used to being consulted about everything. Nora didn't rush. She took a breath, feeling her own body weaker, but kept her chin up. She looked at Harper first, then at him. "Because she needed blood," she said simply. And I had it. It didn't land like a pretty phrase. It landed like a fact. Grant blinked as if he were waiting for a longer explanation, some apology, any sign of submission. But Nora wasn't there to convince anyone. She was there to keep a child alive for one more heartbeat. "Do you understand the risk?" He pressed, now with panic shadowing his irritation. "What if something goes wrong? What if you?" The sentence died in his mouth. For the first time, he couldn't finish a threat or a complaint. Nora glanced at her own arm, at the tube, at the blood leaving her body, and her voice came out with a calm that hurt. "I understand," she said. "I just couldn't pretend it had nothing to do with me." Maya Patel watched in silence, because this moment had already gone beyond any medical protocol. Grant ran a hand over his face, trying to organize the chaos. "But why? Like this? In secret? You work in my house. You." He stopped. He didn't even know how to finish that sentence without sounding small. Nora looked him in the eye, and that's when she dropped the line. No drama, no theatrics, just a raw truth. "If something went wrong, I would have bled loving someone." The air got heavier. Grant stood there like that sentence had pierced his armor and reached a place he hid even from himself. Before he could answer, Nora added in an even softer, almost intimate tone, "And you weren't supposed to be looking at me right now?" "You were supposed to be looking at her." Grant turned toward Harper and saw her small chest rise and fall, a little more stable. But one detail wouldn't leave him alone. That lullaby. The way Nora had said, "I promised." The feeling that, behind this donation, there was a story he spent his whole life refusing to touch. A story that was now standing in front of him, demanding to be faced before that night was over. The monitor kept beeping, but it sounded different now. Not because the hospital had changed, but because inside that room, Grant Halston was no longer the same man who'd stepped into the hallway minutes earlier. He stood by the bed, quiet, like any word might break what was happening. He held his daughter's hand gently, and every so often glanced at Nora like he still wasn't sure she was real. The transfusion continued. Harper was still fragile, but some color was slowly returning to her cheeks, like a shy hint of life. It wasn't much, but in that context, a little became hope. When the medical team finished, Maya Patel said only what needed to be said, no sugarcoating. Vitals more stable, better response than the last time, constant observation. Grant nodded, obedient, like someone who finally understood he didn't command anything in that room. Nora tried to stand and nearly lost her balance. Instinct took over. Grant reached out to help, quick, without thinking. That simple gesture, from a man who never touched anyone without a purpose, came from a place he didn't know he had. Nora held his arm for a second, just long enough to steady herself, then let go discreetly, not wanting to create intimacy where it didn't belong. On the ride home, later that night, the silence inside the bulletproof car wasn't the comfortable silence he was used to. It was a silence full of shame, memory, and unsaid things. When he arrived, Grant walked through the massive living room, past the expensive art and paintings he barely remembered why he'd bought, and none of it seemed important. He saw the immaculate kitchen, shining floors, and realized something that had always been there. The house was organized, but it was cold. He'd built comfort, but he hadn't built presence. And now, after seeing Nora bleed for love, he couldn't pretend that was normal anymore. Nora, on the other hand, went back to her tiny room in the back, body aching and mind full. She didn't tell anyone, didn't call a friend, didn't post, didn't ask for recognition. She just took off her coat, sat on the bed, and stared at her own hands, like she knew she'd done what had to be done, even if it cost her. Upstairs, Grant stood outside Harper's door, listening to her breathing, with no courage to walk in and disturb her. But one point refused to let his chest rest, that lullaby. The way Nora had said, "I promised." The knowing sense that behind this donation was a chapter he'd avoided his whole life, and that now was knocking, demanding to be opened before it was too late. Later that same night, the hospital grew quieter, like even the air had learned to walk on tiptoe. Grant Halston went back to St. Arden without calling ahead, without asking for a cleared hallway. He walked in the way he never walked into anywhere, small. The smell of disinfectant felt stronger, and every echoing footstep made the whole place seem too big for him. In his hand, he still gripped the same expensive phone, but now it felt like dead weight. Before he opened the door to the room, he stood in the hallway for a few minutes, staring at the bed number like he was asking permission. When he went in, Harper was asleep, breathing a little more steadily, and the monitor light blinked slowly in a calm rhythm. Grant walked over to the bed and gently ran his hand over his daughter's head the way he hadn't done in a long time. No rush, no fear of wasting time. Then he saw the chair beside the bed, empty. The chair where Nora had spent hours giving away something he could never buy. That chair hit him like a silent punch. It wasn't special, had no price tag, no story. And still, it seemed to hold everything. Grant noticed a small cloth folded on the seat, simple, smelling of cheap soap, probably forgotten in the chaos. He picked it up with his fingertips like it was fragile, and that's when the full weight of his shame came down. He knew watch brands, investor names, contract numbers, but he didn't know the life of the woman who scrubbed his floors. He'd thought it was normal not to know. In this room, it didn't feel normal. It felt cruel. In the hallway, Maya Patel appeared again, clipboard pressed to her chest, dark circles from her shift under her eyes. Grant looked up at her, and this time there was no arrogance, only a raw request. "She already left?" he asked. Maya nodded. "She asked us not to make a fuss about it." Grant let out a humorless, choked laugh, like he'd just taken another blow. "I don't even really know who she is," he admitted, and the words tore their way out. Maya studied him for a second and replied simply, "Today, she was someone who had, and decided your daughter wouldn't go without." And that's what stayed in the air, heavy and clean at the same time. The miracle didn't come with thunder. It came with quiet footsteps and an outstretched arm. There was no audience, no announcement, no "look what I did." There was just an ordinary, tired, quiet woman saying with her own body, "If I've got it, you won't go without." Grant looked back into the room at his daughter and understood that what he'd been missing most in this whole story wasn't money. It was presence. And when he decided to go after Nora to thank her, reality hit again. He didn't even know where to start, because until that night, he'd never bothered to care. That night, when the hospital got even quieter and the corridor lights turned colder, Grant Halston went back to his daughter's room, without that rushed walk of a man who thinks he controls the world. He stood there, one hand on the side of the bed, watching Harper breathe a little easier and replaying what he'd seen. A simple woman, in yellow gloves, heaving her own blood like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And for the first time in a long time, Grant understood that what hurt most wasn't the lack of solutions. It was the shame of realizing how long he'd gone without really seeing the people around him. He thought about Nora in the quiet of the staff corridor, not as the help, but as someone who'd stepped in where his power couldn't reach. There was no thunder, no spotlight, no pretty speeches. Just reality, raw. Sometimes God doesn't show up shouting. He shows up softly, through someone who says with their actions, "If I have it, you won't go without." Now I want to ask you, what moved you most in this story? Was it her silent gesture? Or the moment he finally broke on the inside? If you've ever lived something like this, or seen someone do a kindness like this, without wanting anything in return, share it in the comments. I really do read what you write. If this story touched you, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Because these stories aren't about money itself. They're about everything money can't buy.